Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. In this video, I'm going to be discussing an overview of the UFO phenomenon, a little bit of its history and the leading theories and, well, all the theories regarding what it is or is not. The UFO phenomenon was popularized in 1947 and later with a pilot named Kenneth Arnold. He was flying his airplane over Mount Rainier or near Mount Rainier, and he saw, I believe it was 8 boomerang-shaped objects that flew as though someone were skipping saucers on the surface of a pond. So they were making like a sort of, a skipping motion or flight path. But they were boomerang-shaped, not saucer-shaped. However, the newspapers called them flying saucers. And so that is where the term flying saucers comes from. And then, of course, a couple of months later, you have the famous Roswell Corona incident. Whatever really happened there, we'll discuss that a little bit. And a few years prior to that, you had a magazine called Amazing Stories talking about spaceships and extraterrestrials and things like that. And so it really took off, mostly in the American imaginations and somewhat in the French imagination, and just became more and more popular since 1947. However, the phenomenon goes back thousands of years. You can read accounts of the same type of erratically flying craft, craft that can make fast 90-degree turns, can move very quickly, disappear in one place and immediately reappear in another place. The craft that move silently and disappear and reappear without any sound, and also craft that move very loudly and disappear and reappear with thunderclap sounds. And such accounts are found in the Old Testament, like in the book of Ezekiel. They're also found in the Hindu Vedic scriptures, such as in the Black Yajurveda, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and most of the Puranas will have at least one UFO account in them. The Puranas being the histories of the gods. There are plenty of accounts that sound just like a modern UFO report of erratically flying craft that are luminous and so on. There are plenty of theories as to what these craft are, or what these objects are, and the most popular one is the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis, or the ETH. This theory has been pushed by Hollywood, by comic books, by even the government at times. It is the most popular theory. Usually when people hear the word UFO, they immediately think extraterrestrials from other planets. This is a nuts and bolts spacecraft, usually metallic, and it's coming from another planet, another material planet, similar to the Earth, perhaps technologically more advanced than our civilization. And it's no surprise to why that's the most common theory, because contactees and abductees push this theory. You go back to Betty and Barney Hill, the famous couple who were abducted driving down through, was it New Hampshire or Maine? And in 1961, they saw a craft, pulled over their car, looked at it through binoculars, started driving on home again. The craft followed them, and then the next thing they knew, they were home like way later than they should have been. They go to hypnotic regression therapy to find out what had happened, and they relate this account of how they had been abducted by beings in that craft. Now, Barney claimed he saw what we would now describe as a little gray alien. Just sort of, he drew a picture, had like a raindrop-shaped head with the quote-unquote wraparound eyes, that, the big kind of oval eyes that go around the side of the head, and that there were what he described as SS officers, Nazi officers, dressed in black and red uniforms with red scarves, looking at him while a medical examination was going on. But his wife Betty described squat, heavy-set, furry creatures that were performing the medical examination. So they both saw two different things. And Betty also said that she was shown a star map. Under hypnotic regression, she was able to crudely draw this star map, and then a few computer scientists got together, and after like 20 years of trying to collate this crudely drawn, basically a piece of 8 by 11 paper with a bunch of dots on it, they said that these aliens were from Zeta Reticuli. And that's where the idea that little grays come from Zeta Reticuli comes from. You have other contactees like George Adamski and Claude Vorlon and such people like that claim that these extraterrestrials talked to them, told them that they were from Venus or from the Pleiades and other places, and that they flew in these craft through space. So it's mostly because of these famous abductees and contactees that were told they were dealing with extraterrestrials. That theory is now very popular. And of course, Hollywood really ran with that idea. There are many counter theories to that, though. I mean, obviously there's no smoking gun that they are extraterrestrial craft. There's no irrefutable piece of evidence that can actually support it. That's why it's still a hypothesis. It's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's not even a theory. There are religious communities, mostly part of the Abrahamic religions like Christianity, who will say that flying saucers, UFOs, and these beings are angels and or demons. You have people who, especially in the Latino community, believe in a lot of these apparitions are actually the Virgin Mary, sort of appearances of the Virgin Mary. That goes, in 1917, you have the Fatima, Portugal sightings that were viewed by thousands of people. These 3 little girls had been getting visions once a month for a few months of someone that they called the Virgin Mary was telling them, like, giving them these prophecies, and the Catholic Church controls these prophecies that were written down by these 3 little girls. The town of Fatima caught wind that these girls were like receiving visions. So some people would follow the little girls because, they'd go to this particular tree, they'd hear the Virgin Mary, then say, like, come back to this tree next month at the same time. So a few people went with them the next time, and the little girls would go into this trance, and they would get, like, wide-eyed, their jaws would drop, and nobody else would see anything, but everybody else would hear a buzzing in their ear. The girls would be seeing an apparition of a woman, a luminous woman. And then the following month after that, there were thousands of people that followed them to this tree. And many of them, again, heard a buzzing that they described like a bee buzzing around inside their ears, but saw nothing. And then the following month, it was, I believe, in the summer of 1918, there were tens of thousands of people in this field, and it was raining, and then a big silvery disc, a luminous disc also. It looked metallic but also emitted light, and it was disc-shaped, appeared in the sky, and it flew down, it swooped down, they said, just over the people's heads many times. It kept just going up and down and coming within feet of these people's heads, and the people were terrified. However, when the silvery disc showed up, the clouds disappeared, and every time the ship swooped down, it would dry up all of the water and warm up all of the people underneath it. So after swooping down a bunch over this whole crowd, the crowd and the dirt below them were actually dry, even though they had been standing in a few hours worth of rain. The whole field was dry, their clothing was dry, and there were thousands of healings. Crippled people could move their limbs again. Sick people got well. There were 4 accounts of blind people who were able to see again. There was 1 account of a deaf person who was able to hear again. And this all happened at the same time during this UFO sighting. And the interpretation is largely religious, especially throughout Portugal. There's a little like statue with a plaque on it that commemorates the event, and it talks about an apparition of the Virgin Mary coming out of the sun. There were plenty of such accounts, not so dramatic and massive as that one, but on smaller scale. There was a woman who, she never disclosed her name, but she's mentioned in a book by Diana Pulowski, where she was praying all night for her sick dog to get better, and a tiny, like, upside down U-shaped object showed up into her house about the size of a soccer ball, floated around her dog, scanned her dog with a green light, and her dog got better. And she didn't, she was under the impression that she was going to have to put her dog down the next day. And she said that she called it her angel. She said that she was praying all night for this to happen. And then it apparently did. So, of course, there are plenty of people who talk about seeing UFOs, and then they go to church on Sunday, and then their lives are ruined. Their congregation turns their back on them. They're told that they're, congregating with demons now. They're having, they're just rejected by their communities after they share their experiences with their church community. A lot of the times the church community will shun them, and they will no longer be welcomed in that church, or they'll just get the stink eye if they ever go back. And it's because a lot of people believe they're dealing with demons now, or that they're possessed by demons, or there's some sort of occultist having, summoning demons, and they just lose their trust and are pariahs at that point. Of course, still on the angels and demons topic, you have some of the less experienced, less scientific, and less spiritual people who believe themselves to be very correct, the flat earthers, who think it's all angels and demons, there's no such thing as extraterrestrials, it's all a deception, and they're extremely paranoid and extremely dogmatic about it. You'll find that stuff all over the internet, especially on YouTube. These flat earthers, they will scream their heads off at you that you're ignorant and asleep because you believe in ET, or you believe in space and stuff like that, and they'll just flip a crap on you, talking about how it's angels or how it's demons. It's like they don't even talk about the possibility that they're angels. They're just obsessed with the fact that they're demons. And I have read, I don't even know how many hundreds and hundreds of comments and hundreds of videos on that topic. So I guess you could call that a theory, a popular theory, although it's not really founded on much of anything. That's just like a paranoid opinion that someone came up with and started spreading like a mind virus. There aren't many accounts of demonic activity regarding UFOs. There are plenty more accounts of what you would call angelic activity. So to interpret angelic activity and spontaneous healings as a demonic deception is clearly not based in anecdotes or evidence. It's just based in the paranoid fear that you are being deceived. So again, that's just another hypothesis, hardly even a theory. Another particularly interesting theory is the interdimensional theory. This is mostly enforced by an author and UFO researcher named Jacques Vallée. He's a computer scientist and an astrophysicist, and probably the best ufologist, in my opinion, that we know of. Of course, I'm sure there are better ufologists in like secret societies or military projects, but we'll never know who they are, and they'll never publish their findings. I would say the best known ufologist in history would be Jacques Vallée. He has done so much for the UFO community. He has just thrown a lot of ideas out there that challenge scientists, they challenge ufologists. Many ufologists hate him for his ideas because they are so strange, and people who are obsessed with nuts and bolts interpretations can't stand this guy. He talks about interdimensional beings. He talks about the old fairy folklore from the Celtic areas like England and Ireland and Scotland and all throughout Europe. He compares UFO encounters and encounters with alien beings to all of the old mythologies and folklores, and says that, UFO encounters have way more to do, modern UFO encounters have a lot more to do with fairy folklore than they do with potential extraterrestrials. And there's another researcher named John Keel, who his theory kind of dovetails with Jacques Vallée's theory. They both think that the UFO phenomenon is some sort of consciousness conditioning phenomenon, that the intelligence behind the phenomenon is trying to give us certain religious beliefs and certain scientific beliefs, and they have very good points, Jacques Vallée and John Keel. If you look at the development of scientific knowledge and religious belief systems, it always begins in the fringe. The fringe is always suppressed to begin with, and then that suppressed fringe will eventually become the mainstream and will overthrow the society that suppressed it. So back 2,000 years ago, you had the Roman Empire, which was essentially pagan or imperially deistic and mostly rational. They were economic materialists most of the time. And then you have this cult that came up with a very strange doctrine about, beasts of the apocalypse that were going to rise up out of the sea and giant, like a giant god man made out of fire and water who was going to judge the wicked and create, this new kingdom that was going to come from the sky and descend onto the earth, and only the people who believed in this cult were going to be allowed into this kingdom, and everyone else was going to be destroyed. And like they described, beasts with 10 heads and just this extremely bizarre doctrine that was ridiculed. Of course, the Platonics ridiculed it, the Roman elite and intellectuals ridiculed it. These people were fed to freaking lions, for crying out loud, just for believing in it. And it was very subversive, this new cult. It didn't believe in any man-made governments or laws. It only believed in God's law. And so the Roman state didn't like that. This new cult would not worship the Roman Empire as a god, the Roman emperor as a god, because that was heresy to them. And they were persecuted for about 300 years, 400 years, until they overthrew the Roman Empire. And they became the Roman Empire. They became the Holy Roman Empire in the Catholic Church. So you can't underestimate what a fringe belief will become. Now, I'm going to do a whole video on UFO cults. This is just a general overview, but I wanted to point out that very important idea that ufology has been pushed to the fringe of scientific investigation. It's been pushed to the fringe of religious inquiry. It's been pushed to the fringe in many ways. You really just can't talk about UFOs or your experiences with UFOs because people will call you crazy. And if science doesn't like step up its game and like admit that there is a real phenomenon and that it has to be studied, then we could very likely have our whole society overthrown by a fringe cult eventually. These new age UFO cults could gain the upper hand, because as long as UFO studies and the people who have UFO experiences are pushed to the fringe, they can't turn to science. They can't turn to our society for answers or for help, so they're going to go into the hands of dangerous cults. As like science thinks it's trying to crush pseudoscience or whatever. No, it's not. It's just denying a fact of life that there are UFOs and there are people who have encounters with strange beings. And as much as it is ridiculed, people will move into the hands of dangerous cults who promise them answers. Science has turned their back on experiencers, abductees, contactees, and people who have witnessed sightings. Science calls those people crazy idiots who are drunk or on drugs or schizophrenic or stupid or making shit up. And they get really disillusioned by science, and then here comes this cult that says like, oh, I'll give you the answers. And now they're in the hands of predatory cults. So that has been infused in the history of the UFO phenomenon. I mean, Constantine, who founded the Catholic Church, saw a burning cross in the sky. And that's what made him believe that he should found a Christian empire after overthrowing the Roman Empire. So you could claim that the Catholic Church was founded based on a UFO event. There are many such events like that. It can't be ignored. John Keel also has another theory that the intelligence behind these UFOs is a supercomputer, some sort of ancient, perhaps artificial intelligence that he says is on the fritz and now just doesn't know what it's doing. It was built to condition human consciousness maybe millions of years ago, and it's sort of just running on autopilot now and doing all kinds of crazy and absurd things. That leads into Philip Corso's theory. John Keel called it the Trojan horse, and Philip Corso really doubled down on that idea that the UFO phenomenon is a type of Trojan horse, especially the crashes, the UFO crashes that occurred throughout the 1920s all the way up to today. There, and the most famous one, of course, being the Roswell-Corona 1947 incident, which many people believe was the crash of some type of object from the sky. Some people even believe that there were 4 strange creatures. The bodies of what we would call little grays were also recovered. Philip J. Corso was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he had the Office of Foreign Technology, or the Desk of Foreign Technology, something like that, after Major Truedale gave him the authority to take over his position. And his job was to, according to a book that Corso wrote, basically when it was like on his deathbed in the 90s, he wrote a book called The Day After Roswell. He claimed that he had to take technology recovered from crashed objects and get it into the private sector, what we would call the military-industrial complex, to just get it developed and to enter it into the commercial market so that people could buy this technology. And he claimed things like the transistors, the silicon wafer microchip, Velcro, fiber optic cabling, and all this stuff that we take for granted now and use in all of our technology actually came from crashed vehicles. Mostly from like Roswell Corona, but from many other crashes as well. And he had to go to these corporations and just say like, oh yeah, we recovered this from the French during World War II, or we recovered it from the Germans during World War II. But basically he says that they recovered it from extraterrestrial crashes. Corso then goes on to say that he believes that these bodies that were recovered were engineered by a supercomputer, an artificial intelligence that comes from another dimension, and that these crashes are a Trojan horse, that we're using this technology now that we recover from those crashes, we've built computers with it, and now computers run our society. The silicon wafer microchip has completely changed everything. You have to think like in 1968, we democratically elected Richard Nixon for president of the United States, which people think is the most important thing, especially modern liberals. They think voting is so important, democracy is so important, and this is what our society is governed by, is by our like free ideals of democracy and stuff. But then what also happened in 1968 was the silicon wafer microchip was introduced to the world market. Nobody voted for that, yet that had a much more profound effect than voting for some president. So nobody voted for this crap coming out of Silicon Valley, this stuff coming out of the military-industrial complex, and yet it has far more impact on our society than voting. All this technology we're using, Philip Corso says, comes from extraterrestrials. Humans did not invent it. So that's just profound. If that's true, of course, Philip Corso ran with disinformation artists back in the 1960s down in like far right-wing Texas. That's a whole other subject that you can research Philip Corso on. He was the editor of some newspapers and magazines that were just full of really weird misinformation. So his book, The Day After Roswell, could just be a total fabrication just to get us afraid of something. But if there's any truth to it at all, it's worth considering that these crashed saucers are sort of like, you could think of them as like sperm being sent from an AI machine onto the womb of our Earth. And then our scientists and engineers get together and start reverse engineering this stuff, and like our society is being used as a womb to grow and give birth to an artificial intelligence that might just wake up one day once our society is sufficiently digital, sufficiently controlled by computers, and there is sufficient enough infrastructure around to where this AI can wake up or conquer the world, conquer our cities, conquer us in some way, that it will. And we'll have done it to ourselves unknowingly, because the origins of the silicon wafer microchip have been kept secret from us. So that's another theory, is that these flying saucers are not aliens from other planets. They just look like aliens from other planets. They're like an alien computer from perhaps another dimension entirely. Of course, another leading theory, these UFOs are just military black budget projects. They're just exotic vehicles that have been made by military or corporations or secret societies, and they're totally terrestrial, totally human. And They're either nuts and bolts craft, or they're sort of like Merkaba type spiritual manifestations that people can create using their thought power. That's not too difficult to research something like that. Another theory is that this is sort of like that Nick Bostrom ancestor simulation theory, or it kind of goes along with Philip K. Dick, the sci-fi writer's theory, or the Wachowski brothers, the Matrix theory, that we live in a computer simulation, and UFOs and their occupants are sort of like avatars for the computer programmers when they want to like come into the simulation, kind of like how we would turn on a PlayStation and take control of an avatar. They come into the computer simulation, they take control of an avatar that can it's not subject to the laws of physics. They can sort of do whatever they want, fly around, look like whatever they want. They can check up on the virtual world that they built, maintain its parameters, condition our consciousness to be within the parameters that they desire, so the simulation goes on in the way they want it to. And that's the computer simulation theory. Obviously, if we're in a computer simulation, there's no such thing as aliens, there's no such thing as space, there's no such thing as the planet, so they would be avatars of computer programmers or the simulation programmers. One of the more spiritistic theories is that they are the ghosts of dead people, these flying saucers. That dovetails a little bit with Jacques Vallée's folklore theory. If you go back through case histories from before 1947, if you go to like the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries looking for UFO type phenomenon, you will find discs that float around that will have dead relatives standing around them. There are many stories like that. Carl Jung mentions that in his book called Flying Saucers. Carl Jung's theory is that humanity has become so materialistic that our spiritual aspects, our spiritual yearnings have been suppressed so much that they have to be compensated for, So because our spiritual yearnings and spiritual outlook doesn't have an outlet, especially since the 19th century, well, beginning in like the 16th century, but really hitting home in the 19th century, humanity has become increasingly materialistic, more and more and more materialistic. Materialistic science, materialistic worldview, and everything's just so materialistic, and spiritual things are laughed at. Religion is like, out of style. And he says that our spiritual culture has been so repressed that it actually manifests as physical objects now. Like, Carl Jung doesn't deny the physical nature of UFOs, but he says they are psychic manifestations. He knows they can leave you sunburn at midnight, radiation burn, give you temporary blindness, leave scars on your body. He admits all of these things in his book, but he says, like, that's just how powerful the human subconscious is that if it is repressed, it can produce physical external effects. So the human race is sort of subconsciously producing the UFO phenomenon, which is why they show up in a circular shape, which is symbolic of wholeness. Because we lack wholeness, we are projecting symbols of wholeness. Because we lack spiritual wholeness, we're entirely materialistic, left-brained right now. We've sort of shut off our right brain. We are suppressing our desire for wholeness, so we see circular objects, which is a symbol of wholeness. They are also, they break the laws of physics as we know them. They break all the material laws of science. So it just challenges science. It just flies right in the face of materialistic science, and is just basically laughing at materialistic scientists, saying, like, you actually don't know what you're talking about, and, like, here's proof. And that's another reason why scientists ignore it, because it makes them feel stupid. And you know how much scientists don't like to feel stupid. But the funny thing is some of the dumbest people I know have the most degrees, have the most college degrees. They put their blinders on, they specialize in one thing their whole lives, they study it for 8 years, 12 years to get a doctorate, they write a little dissertation and pass a few tests, and they think they're smart, but they're not. They don't know anything else besides what they had just wasted all their time studying, wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars on university to become, entirely specialized and ignoring all other things, and that somehow makes them smart. John Keel's theory regards the superspectrum, meaning there is a finite spectrum of frequencies that can be perceived by our physical senses. We can only see like the seven colors of the visible light spectrum. Everything infrared and ultraviolet is invisible to us. We can only hear from like about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and anything below 20 hertz or above 20 kilohertz we cannot hear. Same thing with physical objects. We can only interact with physical objects that are at extremely low frequencies, like one oscillation per 5,000 years. Like a rock would have a vibration of like 0.000000000 1 hertz, meaning that it vibrates once every like 20,000 years, and that's how we can touch it. And anything below or above that we cannot touch. So UFOs come from higher ranges of the spectrum that our five senses cannot perceive. And there's a lot of evidence for this. The most striking piece of evidence is that a lot of these UFOs, when they're high in the sky, they are translucent, whitish, sometimes violet in color, and as they come closer to the ground, they actually go through the color spectrum from violet down through blue, down through the green range, down to the red range, and then they look like solid objects when they're just a couple hundred feet above the ground. So it's like literally looks like they're coming down. And also the skipping stone flight path of a lot of these flying saucers, like you're skipping a saucer on the surface of a lake, is an interesting analogy. If you think of Socrates' last words, when Socrates was on his deathbed and he was giving his last philosophical dissertation, he describes all the creatures who live on the bottom of the ocean and how they know nothing about what goes on outside of the ocean. Their whole universe, the dimension they live in, is just the ocean. And they don't know anything about human civilization. They know nothing about humanity and what we do and the cities we build and the wars we fight. And all this stuff goes on while like these little starfish are like, hundreds of feet below us in the water, and they've never seen a human being. They've never seen a bow and arrow. They've never seen a horse or a chariot. They've never seen a tower or a farm. They know nothing about this. And that humans are like that. We are like these crustaceans and starfish at the bottom of the ocean, not knowing anything going on above us in this whole other dimension, this whole other universe that's above us. We are utterly ignorant of it. And so when flying saucers show up and they look like they're skipping on the surface of water while they're in our atmosphere, it really hits that analogy home. It's like, wow, it's like our atmosphere is like a body of water to them. It's like a lake to them or an ocean, and they're skipping along our atmosphere like we would skip a stone on a lake. And it just really makes you think of that Socratesian metaphor. So that, they're from like another dimension, or they're from out there, or they're from a higher range of the super spectrum. And that's just a fun little mental exercise. There's a theory that became popular in the 1980s about the UFOs, is that they are time travelers. They're terrestrial. They're humans from the future. There's the Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980 at an Air Force base in England, where there were many witnesses to this. It was like 9 feet wide, almost pyramidal, kind of tetrahedral shaped object that landed in the woods. It left imprints on the ground. It made a bright light that stopped after like 30 feet, only illuminated within 30 feet, nothing else. It basically like teleported behind people and in front of people. And one of the officers had touched it, and then for like months after that, he kept getting these flashes of binary code kind of in his mind's eye. He wrote them down, all these ones and zeros down in his notebook, and they had been translated to basically talk about how like the human race needs to discover the secrets of Atlantis in order to avoid a future cataclysm. And this pushed the theory that UFOs could be time travelers from the future trying to prevent something horrible that's going to happen in the near future. Another idea that pushed that was that there's an old German experiment that was being built that began in the 19-teens, and then when the Nazis came to power, the Nazis took over the scientific project It was called Die Glocke, or the Bell. You've probably heard of this. It's like all the rage in conspiracy theory circles. Everybody loves talking about the bell. And it was a bell-shaped object. It used counter-rotating fields of mercury, according to Joseph Farrell and some of these declassified documents. And of course, you have the Black Yajurveda in ancient Vedic scripture talking about how to build one of these flying machines that we would call a UFO. The Hindus call them Vimanas. And part of the blueprints that is explicitly written in the Black Yajurveda is using counter-rotating fields of mercury. They claim, these declassified documents that are difficult to validate, and the work of Joseph Farrell and other researchers claims that this bell, this acorn bell-shaped thing, could fly and could perhaps, it could emit crazy amounts of radiation that killed plants and people, and it's potentially a time-traveling device as well, because in 1965, in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, an object that perfectly fits the description of the bell fell out of the sky, crashed in the forest, and the army was basically already there waiting for it. The army showed up like immediately, as if they knew it was going to crash. And it was, carried away. There's a little statue of it in the Kecksburg Museum that you can look at. It's like an artist mock-up of what it might have been. The last theory is more along the lines of the New Age one. The spirit of Gaia, or the spirit of the earth, the sort of world soul that's it's similar to Jacques Vallée and John Keel's idea of consciousness manipulation, that the earth is trying to get us to calm down, stop polluting so much, become more spiritual again, stop using nuclear weapons and stuff like that, because that's what the contactees and abductees sort of report after they've been contacted or abducted. They're like, they feel a little more spiritual. They say that the aliens told them not to pollute anymore, stuff like that. So the spirit of the earth is just trying to, it's sort of like manipulating us into calming down by pretending to be an authority figure, like an advanced alien race with better technology, or an advanced spiritual being, or an ascended master, as the Theosophists would call these people, the space brothers, that, the spirit of the earth just makes this illusion, this sort of friendly deception of an authority figure, because we don't listen to ourselves and we don't listen to each other, we only listen to authority figures. So the spirit of the earth is smart, realizes that we can only be conditioned through authority figures, so it projects authority figures and it tells us to stop shitting where we eat. That's the Gaia theory. So throughout time, the nature of the UFO phenomenon kind of changes. You can go back to the 9th century and you can read a couple of accounts of UFOs in Ireland and Scotland. And these UFOs look like caravels, sailing ships made out of wood with sails on them, like that you would see on the ocean. And there would be ghost ships floating through the sky, and they would drop an anchor down, and a sailor would climb down the anchor as if he was going into the ocean. It looked like he was swimming, like this ghostly man coming down this rope, looking like he's swimming, and then trying to cut the anchor loose from a rock that's on the ground. And there are two accounts of this, one in the 9th century and one in the 12th century, of that happening. And apparently some of these people witnessed this and grabbed onto this sailor, this guy who looked like a sailor, and it looked like he was about to drown. So one of the priests from a local church told him to let him go because he's going to drown. And they cut the cable, they cut this ghostly rope off the anchor and let the sailor go back into his ghostly skyship and sailed away. And apparently they kept the anchor in the church for centuries. And there's another incident that was almost exactly like that happened a few centuries later, and they captured 3 people that came out of this ship, and they were about to be stoned to death because the town's population thought they were witches or something, or demons, and the bishop of the town came out and spared them and said you shouldn't treat guests like this. And he quoted the Bible that treat strangers well lest they be angels in disguise and stuff like that. But those types of ships didn't exist until the 15th century. Big caravels with many sails on them. So it was very shocking to these people to see such giant ships floating in the sky. But then we eventually built such ships. And of course, you have the so-called Age of Exploration in the 16th century. You can see that happening again in the late 19th century. Throughout the world, mostly in the United States, you saw this thing that looked like a blimp that could fly extremely fast, like way faster than a blimp. They talked about it like a bullet out of a gun. That's how fast it could fly. But it was able to slow down. People could see the lights on the side of it, spotlights coming down, and it looked what we would call like a Zeppelin. And this was in the 1896 that this happened. But of course, we know that the Zeppelin wasn't invented until I think it was like 1911. So in 1896, people are seeing Zeppelins, and when the Zeppelin would land, there would be people wearing like, an engineer, like a mechanic's overalls, working on these piston things, and we didn't really use piston engines until like 1914. So you have this idea that the UFO phenomenon kind of shows up in a technological manifestation that is just slightly ahead of ours, and then it kind of inspires people to build new technologies. This brings us up to Dr. Wilbert Smith, who was a Canadian scientist. He was a physicist and a magnetic engineer, an electrical engineer. He worked with the Canadian Transit Authority on experiments trying to determine what UFOs were. He came up with this theory of geomagnetism. He came up with a report in 1954 that they were probably extraterrestrial. That's a quote of his. And that they were using the magnetic field of the Earth for the propulsion of their ships. But the thing is throughout the 1940s, before he founded the Project Magnet in 1950, he claimed he had been in telepathic contact with the Space Brothers. Again, there's that word Space Brothers that George Adamski started using, that Claude Vorlon uses, and that a lot of other people throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s, called these friendly visitors Space Brothers. And everyone who uses the term Space Brothers and started these UFO cults about Space Brothers are very much obsessed with advances in technology, thinking that technology is going to make our world better. And they all claim to be in telepathic communication with these ET, and then they go on and invent technology that a lot of us, we use a lot of these people's technology, Even Nikola Tesla claimed that he sometimes received telepathic messages from Martians. And we use a lot of Tesla's technology these days. Another physicist who was along the lines of Tesla, Steinmetz, he also talked about beings who lived in the ether that would communicate with people. A lot of, our electrical infrastructure today is based on a lot of Steinmetz's work. So the UFO phenomenon has then been showing up in like these extremely exotic formations since the 1940s of like really exotic technology that operates using our minds. The flying saucer people would tell the contactees that like you need to use your mind in order to fly a flying saucer. You need to be like mentally and spiritually advanced. And now you have these jet fighters that work off of like your eye movements. They work off of like your blood pressure. You hook up an EKG inside of the helmet, and you can then like activate certain systems by using mental impulses. So it seems like the UFO phenomenon shows up in ways that's just like one step ahead of our technology, and then it sort of inspires us to achieve that technology. Now, for better or worse, we don't know. It could be just another Trojan horse type thing, or it could be the Gaia impulse leading us to better advancement. It's still unclear. So to reiterate, the UFO phenomenon is largely ridiculed in the mainstream. People make fun of it. Scientists won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They will refuse to study it. And the scientists who do dare to study it will lose their tenure, they lose their professorships, they lose any ability to earn grants or to apply for grants for money to carry out experiments. There is definitely a concerted, what you might call a conspiracy against the studying of UFOs, at least in an academic sense. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for that. It could be that we are just so materialistic and so dogmatic in our view of Einsteinian and Newtonian physics that we don't want to study new physics, that college professors and scientists, they want to just keep filling up their college classrooms, keep raking in that tuition money, keep selling their books, keep pushing their ideas because they like to feel smart and special. They like to feel like they're correct. They're part of like a high priesthood. You know, go back to the 14th century and tell the Catholic clergy that they're incorrect about their worldview. You will get burned at the stake. It's the same thing today, but instead of getting burned at the stake, they just stop approving your papers, they stop peer reviewing your books, and they stop giving you grant money. It's essentially like being metaphorically burned at the stake by a dogmatic clergy. So that's definitely one reason. Another reason it could be that these UFO cults that want to swell their numbers will publicly ridicule the UFO phenomenon, but privately be in support of it. So they will influence academics to not want to study it. They will influence academics to say this is a bad idea, and then in private they're recruiting more and more people to their cult because these people can't go into academics. They can't turn to mainstream science, so they have to turn to the cult. So the mainstream ridicule of ufology is great for UFO cults. So UFO cults might be behind some of the academic ridicule. Of course, you have the Condon Report and the Robertson Panel reports of the 1950s, who, these reports were government-sponsored reports on UFOs and public perception. The Condon Report said you should not teach students about UFOs because UFOs is pseudoscience, and we have a responsibility as scientists to keep all things like witchcraft and ufology out of science. So to teach ufology and to teach unorthodox science is going to make everybody stupid, so therefore don't teach it at all. That was the Condon Report. The Robertson Panel Report was a little more manipulative. They said we have to manage public perceptions of this because the Brookings Institute basically recommended it. You remember what happened in 1938 when Orson Welles gave his War of the Worlds broadcast, and a lot of people didn't realize it was a fictional broadcast. They literally thought aliens were invading New Jersey, and that the world was ending, and it was chaos. So the Robertson Panel and the Brookings Institute said, we need to manage public perceptions of UFOs because people are stupid and panicky, and we don't want them to know anything about it. It also recommended that people who think of UFOs are also interested in overthrowing the monetary system. And that's based on laws of 1913. It's treason. As an American citizen, you cannot attempt to overthrow the monetary system. That's considered high treason. So UFO people who talk about anti-gravity and free energy are essentially talking about a Star Trek type moneyless civilization of abundance. That's sort of Jacques Fresco, Venus Project type thing. And there have been a few UFO cults and technologists and electrical engineers who have been imprisoned for attempting to overthrow the monetary system. Like Otis, like Doctors Otis and Ralph, who are successors of Tesla, had been thrown in jail. Ralph wasn't thrown in jail, but Otis was. They tried to get him tax fraud for skipping out on $800 worth of taxes or something and imprisoned him for 14 years. That's obviously not why they imprisoned him. They imprisoned him because he was working on flying saucer technology, and they claimed he was attempting to overthrow the monetary system. So another theory about the UFO phenomenon, which is sort of like the time travel theory, and it's also mixed in with the Gaia Theory, is that these beings from Venus are not actually from Venus. According to Rudolf Steiner's teachings, I mentioned in a previous video, the Earth and the human race evolves, and the different stages of evolutions are actually named after the planets. So in the future, there will be a Jupiter stage of evolution and a Venus stage of evolution. So there were all these utopian aliens coming from their Venus civilization, where everything's great, there's no suffering, there's no war, everybody's spiritual. All the technology is based on spiritual principles, and they're from Venus. So were they actually from Venus, or were they from a future state of Earth evolution, the Venus stage of Earth evolution? And it also makes you wonder why Jacques Fresco called his utopian project the Venus Project. There were other aliens from that time period, or aliens talking to people like Claude Vorlon and George Adamski, saying that they were from the planet called Clarion, which obviously has the name Clarion kind of invokes ideas of light and purity and spirituality, clarity. And they said that they told this one contactee that your planet blocks the view of my planet. So, like, what does that mean? Does that mean literally, like, because of astronomical configurations in the sky that we just can't see it because it's always, like, I don't know, blocked by some other planet? Or is it that, like, our planet, our materialistic plane, disables us from seeing the spiritual plane? So, again, is it like a spiritual phenomenon? Now, the UFO phenomenon is always accompanied with a reality distortion effect. There's a YouTube channel called Dark Journalist with a guy named Daniel Least, and he kind of coined the term. He didn't really coin the term, but I mean, he basically did. Apotheum, where it's like a reality distortion effect, and you can see a lot of this where time alters. Some people will be abducted by aliens and think a week went by when only like 5 minutes went by, and they'll have like a week's worth of facial hair growth on them and stuff like that. Or they'll think only 5 minutes went by, but like 2 weeks went by. You know, you have Travis Walton and Betty and Barney Hill who experience these time distortion effects during their abduction experiences. There's space effects where people will only be able to see the UFO and their peripheral vision turns black or all white, and they can't see anything else except the UFO. You know, people get levitated up out of bed, or they get levitated out through the wall and their bodies actually pass through the wall. Sometimes the alien creatures will pass through the wall too. And there are all sorts of these effects, reality distorting effects, physics distorting effects. And, you know, people get hypnotized. You know, it can be difficult for people to talk about the UFO phenomenon or to even pay attention to it. There are many accounts of photographers, professional photographers with cameras like hanging around their necks. My dad's friend in 1981, there was a huge UFO sighting up Route 287 in New Jersey. Actually, it was Route 87 in upstate New York, right across the border. And this gigantic ship, it must have been 1,000 feet in diameter, and maybe only 200 feet over the ground. And hundreds of people pulled over on the highway during rush hour. It was like 7 p.m. People coming home from work. And hundreds of people just stopped their cars and were up looking at this enormous thing. It had lights and windows, and it was beaming spotlights down onto the highway over the people. And it was this massive event. And, I mean, you could look it up. Northern New Jersey, Southern New York, 1981. Route 287, Route 87. And he was a professional photographer and he had 2 cameras hanging around his neck, and he just didn't think of taking photos. There's an account from the early 80s of someone, of a whole family watching a UFO over their neighbor's house, and again, nobody thought to go inside and get the camera. In 1945, there was that UFO sighting off the coast, I think it was in San Diego, where there was like military artillery shooting shells, hundreds and hundreds of shells for I think it was 2.5 hours. They were shooting at this flying saucer, and thousands of people witnessed this in the city. And they all woke up, it's like 2 in the morning, and they're looking at this thing, and most of them only looked at it for about 5 or 10 minutes and then went back to bed. The military is literally shooting at a flying saucer, and these people are like, meh, I'm just going to go back to sleep. So clearly there's like a mental distortion, perhaps akin to hypnosis, that accompanies it. It's also difficult to talk to people about it, about the UFO phenomenon. Their eyes will glaze over, they'll try to change the subject. A few days later, you'll be like, oh, remember when I told you about this? And they'll be like, you never told me about that. And they literally like will forget that you even had the conversation, even though they might be very open-minded people. They might be very open-minded, they might love stories of UFOs, but when you start talking about it, a lot of the time there's a hypnotic effect associated with the phenomenon. And people forget that it happened, they're not interested in it, even though normally they would be very interested in it, but when an event is actually happening, or a conversation is actually happening, they glaze over and zone out and don't want to talk about it. So there are all these reality and mentally distorting effects associated with it. And of course, you can look up the philosopher from the 17th, 18th century named Emanuel Swedenborg and his travels with, throughout the cosmos that are very much like contactee experiences. And if you just study his accounts, it's all very psychic and it's all very time and reality distorting. It's all very psychedelic. And the reality distortion effects are very important to come to grips with. People get radiation burns. Some people have died from radiation burns from having UFO experiences. Other people have been healed by the radiations coming from UFOs. So it very much distorts the physical laws, this phenomenon. Also associated with the phenomenon are the poltergeists that occur. When you have a UFO flap, a flap is when there are multiple sightings over a period of time, perhaps a few days, few weeks, few months, where there are just repeated events over and over again. And flaps happen quite often. There was the famous 1952 flap over the U.S., the eastern coast of the U.S. They actually, formation of about 7 flying saucers, or UFOs, showed up over D.C. and over the Capitol building. And then the government scrambled jets and chased them away. And people always say, like, oh, if these UFOs exist, why don't they land on the lawn of the White House or the Capitol building? And it's like, they tried. They would have in 1952, but the military chased them off. So like they literally would have landed on the lawn if we allowed them to. So when people say why haven't they landed, just tell them about, I think it was in June or July of 1952. And there's photographs and video of them flying over the Capitol building. So like, they pretty much did land on the lawn. But anyway, when a flap occurs, there will be poltergeist activities. People's blinds will flip up on their windows. People's papers and pens on their writing desks will start spinning around or floating. People's electricity will turn off and car engines will shut off. People will hear tapping on wooden surfaces in their house. They'll hear voices, like whispering voices coming from their house or from places in their house. And all this sort of poltergeisty effects occur when there are UFOs around. Also, what a lot of Sasquatch hunters don't like to acknowledge is that Sasquatch sightings, all of the authentic sightings, are always associated with flying objects of some kind. Maybe a soccer ball-sized ball of orange light, or 40-foot diameter metallic circular craft. And all of the real reports that you can get from actual government agencies that talk about Sasquatch always talk about the sightings with UFOs associated with them, always talk about that Sasquatch footprints will just terminate at a pile of silicates, what a theosophist would call ectoplasm, like ghost goo, that Sasquatch footprints will just stop and then there'll be a pile of silicates there, as if the Sasquatch just sort of dissolved. This is what's called a transmogrification, or a temporary physical manifestation, where a spirit or an interdimensional entity or a superspectral entity wants to enter our more dense material realm, so it takes on a temporary material form. It only works for a little while, and then the material form dissolves into a pile of silicates. So, these poltergeists and transmogrifications are almost always associated with luminous flying objects. All right, now I'd like to recommend some books for you guys, if you're interested. If you've never done any research like this, or if you're trying to get into it. To start, you have the original book by Morris K. Jessup called The Case for the UFO. Now, of course, this is his second book. It's called The Expanding Case for the UFO. And there's the photograph of that UFO that the military shot at off the coast of California that everybody just went back to bed and wanted to ignore. But anyway, Morris K. Jessup's first book, The Case for the UFO, is one of the earliest. I think it was published in 49 or 50. And it just talked about a lot of the scientific characteristics about it. Jessup was a very scientific individual. Most of what we know about UFOs came from his study. The Expanding Case of the UFO, I think is, if you've already done a lot of preliminary research on the UFOs phenomenon, you might consider the case of the UFO to be a bit redundant and boring. You might already know pretty much all the stuff that's in there. So the expanding case of the UFO is a lot more interesting. It's more about selenology, meaning a study of the moon, than it is about a study of UFOs. But it still is very interesting what he talks about. If you've ever played a video game called Destiny, it's you might recognize that photo. Doesn't that look like the ritual places of the hive, an enemy known as the hive that lives on the moon? You know, you have a hole with this rock suspended between 4 chains. You'll see that a lot in the video game called Destiny. Now, that video game has a lot of other stuff like that thrown in there. Those, you know, the guys at Bungie who made the game really did their homework and sort of just threw in a lot of stuff like that. 2 books by John Keel. His most famous one is called Why UFOs? It's kind of really hard to see that cover there. The original title of this book was Operation Trojan Horse. His second book, or rather his last book, is called The Eighth Tower. And this is his theory on ultra-terrestrials in the superspectrum. Now remember, John Keel is also the journalist who wrote about the Mothman in West Virginia. He you know, the Mothman Prophecies was his book that was turned into that movie starring Richard Gere. Jacques Vallée, any book by Jacques Vallée is going to be excellent. But if you just want like a general overview and case studies of his theories, you have The Passport to Magonia. This book also has in the back of it, or like the last, I'd say like the last third, almost half of the book actually, is like a few hundred cases, like a paragraph each description of cases that go back to like the 17th century up to the 1970s or late 60s. If you're interested in the more esoteric side and the more spiritual side of the UFO phenomenon, you can get, of course, you can get Carl Jung's Flying Saucers, The Making of a Modern Myth by Carl Jung. Of course, that's essential. And there's also one, it's lesser known, by an occultist called, his name is Douglas Baker down there, The Occult Significance of UFOs. And this will give you a more spiritual side of UFOs. It's a great companion to Carl Jung's book on flying saucers. They're like peanut butter and jelly. And Douglas Baker he's a profound esoteric philosopher. Any of his books are very good. He's a prolific writer. He's got many books out there. But The Occult Significance of UFOs is quite interesting. Of course, another famous account, or rather 2 accounts, you have Incident at Exeter and The Interrupted Journey. These are basically 2 books in one by John Fuller. He was a journalist, and he covered, you know, the Interrupted Journey is the story of Betty and Barney Hill. And The Incident at Exeter was another abduction case that occurred relatively close in time and space to the Barney and Betty Hill case, and they are both the accounts of the hypnotic regression therapy that the abductees went through. And it's just a word-for-word transcript of the hypnotic accounts with a very minimal commentary by John Fuller. Now, if you want to go like back in time through the just a book of really weird stuff, a lot of it has to do with, you know, what we would call alien beings, strange beings, what Charles Fort called the procession of the damned, and just strange, unexplainable occurrences. You can get Charles Fort's books. This is his collected works, or his complete books. He wrote, I think, like 3 or 4 books. Yeah, The Book of the Damned, Lo, Wild Talents, and New Lands. And of course, you'll hear of something like, oh, that's like a Fortean phenomenon, or you might have heard of the Fortean Society, which is just like, groups of people who study just the weird stuff, like fish falling out of the sky and, 9-foot tall people that were spotted in Manhattan and, UFO abductions and all that sort of stuff. Charles Fort lived in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he just kept track of all the weird crap that he could get his hands on and wrote about it. So it's kind of like it's almost encyclopedic of just weird stuff that has happened. Then we have a book that was inspired by the work of Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who of course was one of the 12 men who walked on the moon, supposedly, depending on how you see that. And he's founded the Foundation for the Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences, otherwise known as FREE. And he wanted to scientifically study consciousness and UFO experiences. So this thick book here was released like a year ago, and it's based on 25 or so years of studies. It's called Beyond UFOs. Edited by Ray Hernandez and a few other people down there. And I have some significant issues with this book, although I recommend getting it and studying it. But it's premised, it's entirely premised, and it's not really the fault of the researchers. It's just the idea that book goes into how the UFO phenomenon is very strange. It's more psychic, it's more spiritual, it's more based on consciousness than on physical stuff. And it's based on, they sent out surveys. They sent some surveys out over the internet. They sent some surveys out while they were like going on college campuses. They went to like businesses that allowed them to go, like freaking strip malls. Like they gave out thousands of surveys to people over the course of, I think it was 10 or 12 years. Asking about whether or not they had had alien encounter experiences and just giving all the details that they could. Like so many details, so many questions, all these detailed questionnaires, and there's like 3 or 4 levels of questionnaires that they got through. And the thing is all these reports, and they try to collate them, they try to make statistics off of them so they can like look at, statistically what are alien encounter experiences like. And these scientists and researchers have come to like conclusions that the UFO phenomenon, the extraterrestrial contact phenomenon, or the alien contact phenomenon is largely positive and of spiritual benefit. But think about that. They asked people to voluntarily give their stories. Do you honestly believe like a rape victim is going to talk about when they got raped? Of course not. The only people who are going to tell you about their encounter stories are people who are comfortable with it, people who are proud of it, people who have benefited from it, and people who are happy about it and are willing to share it and talk about it. People who had horrible, tormenting, torturous experiences are not about to be like, oh yeah, let me just tell some strangers about how I was sexually abused by aliens, about how I was chopped into pieces by aliens, about how my fetus was stolen by aliens, about how they did painful medical examinations and ridiculed me, about how they screamed in my face, about how they tortured me, about how they dropped me in a cold, muddy field and paralyzed me for 45 minutes, and then I had to crawl home, scraping my knees on rocks and getting chased by snakes. Like, no one's going to tell you about those terrible experiences. So the fact that they came to conclusions that the UFO phenomenon is largely positive and benevolent is absolutely biased and premised. But if you want to know about the positive experiences, then this book is full of them. So, like, it's good to read it. I'm not saying don't get it. It's great research. It's excellent research. Just understand that it's totally freaking premised. And another thing is that it was not written by a writer. It was written by a handful of scientists and statisticians. And let me tell you, these people absolutely suck at writing. They will give you an introduction to what their paper is about to be about. Each chapter is written by a different person. They'll give you an introduction, what it's about to be about. Then they'll give you a short summary of what it's about to be about. Then they'll give you an outline of what the paper is about to be about. Then they'll give you the paper and all its details, and then at the end they will give you a conclusion, which is just another summary of what they just told you. So you will literally read the same paper in 5 different forms. You see how thick this is? It could literally be 1/5 this size and still contain the same amount of information. Getting through this book was a chore and a half. I swear they should make a truncated, summarized version of this, because, like, just give me the important stats and piss off with your repeating of the same thing. You don't need to give me a summary of what you just told me. You don't need to give me a bullet point list of what you just told me. You do not need to give me an introduction to what you're about to tell me. Just tell me the information and leave me alone. So sorry for that ranty book review, but it was horrible to get through that freaking book. And then a really interesting one that just came out by a guy named Russell Brinagar. This one is called Overlords of the Singularity. And this kind of goes along with that Trojan horse thing. It's the idea that, like, UFOs are here to manipulate us into making certain technology that we're going to, use for transhumanism. Like cyborg stuff, internet stuff, virtual reality stuff, and genetic modification stuff. And Brinagar doesn't take a stance for it or against it. In some instances, he's for it. He's kind of like starry-eyed, like, oh, I love transhumanism. It'll make us all happy. So that's kind of stupid. But his theories are fun to read. They're very mentally stimulating. He goes through a lot of the famous cases and some lesser-known cases, and then gives his own little theoretical spin to them. Of course, it's entirely his own theory, coming from his own head. And he's unabashed about the idea that, like, this is just what he thinks. But again, he's a smart guy. He's done his homework, and his theories are very stimulating. So those are books that could definitely get you started on what the UFO phenomenon is. Of course, there are many thousands and thousands of books out there, but I chose the ones that were written by researchers and experiencers. I'm sorry, but I did not include Whitley Strieber's or Brad Steger's or anyone else's books like that, because those people are also science fiction writers. I'm not saying that they're not telling the truth in their research books, but it's just, it doesn't seem like a good idea to be recommending books by Strieber when he's also a best-selling sci-fi writer. I don't know. It just doesn't seem scientific to me to offer that to you. But of course, Whitley Strieber is a prolific author. His famous book Communion is well worth reading. But again, it's completely anecdotal. You don't know if it's true or not. But these books will definitely get you started. So I hope this video wasn't too redundant. I know a lot of people have studied the general theories of UFOs. I hope it was stimulating and interesting. You'll notice I haven't come to any conclusions as to what the phenomenon is or is not. I've been studying this phenomenon for about 25 years, and I don't know, it's like the more I learn, the less I know. And I'm very open-minded about it. I don't care what the truth is, as long as it is the truth. I search for the truth, and I don't try to get blinded by dogmas or opinions or beliefs. I try to just keep an open mind, expose myself to all the different theories, and just keep researching, keep investigating, and look for anomalies. Don't discount anomalies. Actually focus on the anomalies, because mainstream science likes to discount anomalies when they don't fit with their dogma. But when you study the anomalies in the data, that's when you will make the most progress. That's when you will learn the most interesting things. That's when you will make breakthroughs, is when you pay attention to the anomalies instead of throwing them out like mainstream science almost always does. Well, this doesn't fit with what I learned in college, so it must be incorrect. I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen. That's a huge mistake. So I will be going into the UFO phenomenon quite a bit in this video series, because all philosophical, spiritual, and scientific and artistic knowledge kinds of leads and dovetails into the UFO phenomenon. It informs so much about our society, and it is important to get to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon and its influence on our culture. I can't come to any conclusions about what the phenomenon is or isn't, but I know damn well its social effect and its political effect. That is measurable and observable. And so I will be talking a lot about the social and political effects of the UFO phenomenon. in many different ways in future videos, and I will be specifically making a video on UFO cults and their effect on our society. So I hope you continue tuning in. I hope you found this interesting and educational. And if you would like to support my work, there are plenty of rare books that are very expensive that are difficult for me to get my hands on. Any donation would be much appreciated. But of course, you don't have to. You can just like or share the video or do as you please. I'm happy to do this sort of stuff for you anyway. And tune in next time, and hopefully we will learn a little bit more. Thanks for watching, guys.